My lesson today is over the quadratic formula. The standard quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a is the coefficient for x squared, b is the coefficient for x, and c is the constant being added. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4a times c all over 2a. And the quadratic formula is used to solve for the x values inside of a quadratic equation, which are also the 0 values on the x-axis inside of the graph of a quadratic equation. And the quadratic formula can be found by completing the square of the quadratic equation, which we will be doing inside this video. So first you want to start out with the just regular quadratic equation form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And the first thing you want to do is to subtract c from both sides to get it to where it's ax squared plus bx equals negative c. And then the next thing that needs to be done is to get x squared to have the coefficient of 1 so that x squared is by itself. So to do this, we need to divide a by both sides to get x squared by itself. And by doing this, we get x squared plus bx over a equals negative c over a. And then for step 3, we need to add b squared all over 4a squared to both sides. And doing this, we create a perfect square on the left side, and so then we will just simplify it in step 4. By simplifying it, we get x plus b over 2a quantity squared is equal to the negative c over a plus the b squared over 4a squared, which we added in the last step. And then step 5 is we want to multiply negative c over a by 4a over 4a so that the right side has common denominators, not numerators. And this is allowed because 4a over 4a is just equal to 1, so it does not change the value of the quantity. So whenever we do this, like I said, they get the same denominator, so we can combine these terms, which is what we want to do in step 6. And by combining the terms, we get x plus b over 2a quantity squared is equal to b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. And then to get rid of the squared on the left side, we take the square root of both sides, so that it is now x plus b over 2a is equal to the plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. And then we can then split the square root up to both sides of the fraction, and by doing this we are able to make the bottom denominator of the fraction 2a, which is just 4a squared. The square root of that is 2a. So then next, to get x by itself, we want to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So by doing this, b over 2a goes to the other side and x is by itself. This because b over 2a is the numerator or denominator for both fractions, we can combine the fractions to make it x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, the whole quantity, over 2a, which this is the quadratic formula. So we have now showed that by completing the square of the quadratic equation, we can then get the quadratic formula. And then for example 1, we need to solve for x in the equation 3x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0 using the quadratic formula. And we already know that the standard quadratic equation form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So we first need to identify a, b, and c, and by looking at both equations, we can tell what a, b, and c are going to be. So a equals 3, b equals 6, and c equals 1. So now we can use the quadratic formula, and we already know the quadratic formula from finding it by putting the square of the quadratic equation. So the next step is we just need to plug in all the values into the formula. By doing this, it's x equals -6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 3 times 1 all over 2 times 3. Now we just need to simplify the value and solve for x. So by doing this, combining all of the terms in the first part of the equation, we can get that x equals -6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 12 all over 6. And then we can just subtract the 36 minus 12 to get the 24 inside the square root. Then after doing this, we can now split it into two separate fractions so that it will be x equals -6 over 6 plus or minus the square root of 24 over 6. And then by simply simplifying the -6 over 6, we get x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of 24 over 6. And since we know that it is now plus or minus, we can just set the equations up to where it's x equals -1 plus the square root of 24 over 6, or x equals -1 minus the square root of 24 over 6. And then by finding these two values, which are about -0.184 and -1.816, we can look at the graph plugged into a graphing generator and see that these values are actually the 0 values, so it is correct. And then for example 2, we have to solve for x again using the quadratic formula, but the start of this equation is 4x squared minus 5, or equals 5x plus 2. And we know that the standard form of the quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and that this equation is not in that form. So we need to convert it to that form and then solve. So the first thing that we can do is subtract the 5x from both sides to get it to the left side and get it away from the right side. And then after that, we subtract 2 from both sides to get the equation in the form that we want it to, where it's 4x squared minus 5x minus 2 equals 0. And then now that we have the equation that we want, we can identify a, b, and c. And by looking at the equation and knowing our original quadratic equation, we know that a equals 4, b equals -5, and c equals -2. And then again, we can just plug this into the quadratic formula to solve for x. And then this is just plugging in the values again, as we have. And this is computing the -5 squared minus 4 times 4 times -2, which is 25 plus 32. And then we just add those to make it x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 56 over 8. And then we can split up the fractions as we did last time to where it's 5 over 8 plus or minus 56, square root of 56 over 8. And then similar to the last one as well, we split it up into two different answers to where it's x equals 5 over 8 plus square root of 56 over 8, or x equals 5 over 8 minus square root of 56 over 8. And then we plugged in the values again into the calculator and plugged it into a graphing simulator, and we get that the x values are the zeros again, so we know that is correct. This is a solid idea on how to use the quadratic formula.